Thank you all for coming. Adam?
It's a pleasure to see you, Malcolm. It's the first time we've been together, certainly since the pandemic.
Yes, the last time we were on stage together were we not both debating the proposition that cats were better than dogs, or
yes,
dogs were better than cats?
We were, and I took the dog side.
I took the cat side.
And you took the cat side. And I ended my peroration, my claim, by saying that you had to understand that not only was it the case that on the merits all cats were Republicans and all dogs were Democrats, but you also had to understand that all cats were Goyish and all dogs were Jewish. And somehow we won the debate in the middle of Manhattan. It was the dirtiest thing.
Somehow you won the debate?
Yes, I was going to say, it was the dirtiest.
That is by appealing to Jewish Democrats?
Well, there are so few of them in New York, you know, that
yeah,
it showed some bravery, some courage.
You were, yes, playing to the crowd. I suspect there'll be more than a little of that tonight as well. So I wanted to, we're here to discuss your book, but as is always the case, we shouldn't really just discuss the book tonight because we want people to read the book.
Yes.
So I thought we'd talk around the book.
Absolutely. It's a book to talk around.
And I want to do something very specific, but before I introduce the specific thing I'd like to do, I'd like to offer an overly simplistic, highly reductionist theory about the difference between
dogs and cats?
No, between you and I.
Oh.
Or is it you and me?
Me.
Me, yes.
Right, me. That would be one of the differences, right?
Yes. Here's the theory, all right? And as I said, don't tell me that it's overly simplistic because I have already told you it's overly simplistic. Right. I start with an idea I'd like to explore. Search for someone to be kind of window dressing, right. Someone appropriate to dress it up, and then pursue it. This is the problem with my writing, of course, because the reader senses halfway through that I've chosen the subject, the person, simply as a convenience to advance this agenda of mine.
I would dispute that, but all right.
You do the opposite. Essentially, all of your writing is about you meet someone, you fall in love with them, and then you come up with some elaborate theory to justify your affection for your character.
I will accept that as a roughly true. I think, though, that there are a lot of people in your stuff, Malcolm, who live on.
We're not discussing me.
Right, all right.
You can only discuss your half.
I certainly think it's generally true, and I will say this, and I will say it with a certain amount of vanity, that I love getting engaged with people, odd people, strange people, interesting people. And John Updike once said, someone said, what's the purpose of life? And he answered instantly, to give praise. And I always thought that was a beautiful.
Well, this is exactly what I was going to say next, which is the other distinctive feature is of your writing, is that all of your real pieces, as opposed to your critics' pieces, which I don't mean they're not real, but I mean all the pieces of journalism
that are not the higher homework, right?
Yes, you always like the subject. The subject, you're never at odds with the subject, and even when you are at odds with the subject, you go to great pains to suggest you're not really at odds with the subject. This happens in this book, by the way, but we'll get there.
Yes, that's interesting you say that, Malcolm. I've never quite conceptualized it that way. I think it's true. The great kind of transformative moment of my life as a writer, my life as a man, as a person, was when I joined The New Yorker in 1986, and I was put to work writing the Talk of the Town. Now, back in those days, Talk of the Town was beautifully anonymous. That was part of the glory of it, because John McPhee would contribute, or John Updike, and then a little schnorrer like me would be thrown into the mix as well. And it was the great epiphany of my life, because up until that moment, I had been a graduate student. I mean, my whole life I'd been a graduate student. I was a graduate student when I was 6 years old, because I come from, like you, I come from an academic family, and that was the way I had been raised. Pursuing a PhD since third grade. And the way you're trained and taught to think and write is argumentative through buts. My sister, Allison, brilliant mind, still works that way, right? Somebody says something and you controvert it. You say, but on the other hand, that's not entirely true. People say that parenting is the most important thing in the world, but in truth, you can't parent at all.
There's a difference between improv and academia.
Yeah.
Academia is yes, and but.
Yes.
Improv is and, yes, and.
And that's what I realized when I was thrown out onto the streets to go cover table hockey tournaments in Flatbush. A wonderful editor, Chip McGrath, and slack rope walkers lived on houseboats in the Hudson, is that you couldn't argue with these people. You had to illuminate them. You had to caricature them at times. In a positive sense, you had to draw quick portraits of them. But yes, exactly, it was yes and that the only way to write beautifully, the only way to write descriptively, evocatively, significantly, was to construct small descriptive sentences connected by ands, not long contentious sentences disrupted by buts. And that moment of moving from one to the other was the great moment in my life.
You were the first person to come to the New Yorker and be forced to dumb it down.
Well, yes, there's a truth in that, but dumb it down only not in ultimate sense, to embrace a form of, if you like, faux naif writing, to embrace a form of minimalism, that wonderful New Yorker tradition that extends from E.B. White and Thurber right into my fingers, at least, if no one else's, and that, with many others, but I mean, I esteem it particularly. And I think that's true. And so for me, that still is the great breakthrough in my life as a writer. And, even when I finally found the voice that was most my own, and you know how that is, there's that little kind of demon inside you that speaks in your place. It was in Paris, which was the place I loved most in the world, at a moment when we just had a child who, as you know, I thought you were going to say the thing in my work is it always ends up being about my children, no matter what I pretend.
Well, you look for the best in your children. It fits.
Yes.
We're getting there.
We'll get there. We'll get there. So yes, I think that's true, and I think it's one of the things that makes the New Yorker tradition remarkable is its insistence, or its implied insistence through a tradition, that the best writing are small descriptive sentences connected by ands.
Before we get to my little game I want to play, I want to add to that. There's a lovely moment in this book when you're talking about Hemingway and Mailer, who are the opposite, who are pugilists, right?
Yes.
And you say
this is a chapter on my learning boxing.
On learning boxing, and you assert, I think correctly, I thought it was really interesting that that's the reason why their careers fall off after the age of 40. Mailer doesn't really write anything of consequence after the age of 50, and nor does Hemingway, because you can't sustain that kind of confrontation. But if you approach writing as an exercise in finding what it is to love about your subject, you can write forever. I'm being simplistic, but that it is interesting, right, that you didn't have a post-50 fall off.
I hope, Charlie, there are people who might, but no, I don't think, I'm in all without
not Mailer level.
No. I say in the book in that section exactly right, because I've been obsessed with learning boxing in the last few years. A wonderful teacher named Joey Contrada, and I go whenever I can. Is that the truth is, Mailer and Hemingway both present boxing as a parallel to writing. It's like writing. Being a writer is like being a boxer. And as I say in there, if that were true, then every boxer would be standing in the ring looking for his spouse or partner saying, did you see the right I threw? Did you see the right I threw? I have an even better one. Hold on. Just watch this one here. And then you'd throw the other one and say, which one do you like more? Which one do you think is better?
About would be 50 rounds.
About would be 50 rounds, because writers are constantly revising, and they're looking for the approval of the person listening. I'm constantly reading out, 4 versions of the same thing.
About would be 50 rounds, and then it would be edited for television down to 3 rounds.
Yes, that's true. But no, I do think it's true. I think if your engagement with writing is fundamentally predicated on Updike's idea that you're there to give praise, I think it's the closest, it's a secularized form of spirituality, I do think. Now, I should say, Malcolm, you're being kind to me, but, I spend significant amounts of time writing
I could only
criticism.
be kind to you if I'm making this argument.
But I spend a significant amount of times, fighting fights with lefties and righties. I wrote that book about in praise of liberalism, but it wasn't praise. You're right, quite right. It was in praise of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor conducting, having clandestine meetings outside the Rhinoceros.
The only way you can be negative is to praise with faint praise.
I can be negative. Yes, that's probably true.
Praising with faint. Okay, so here's what I want to do.
Yes.
I'm just gonna name names from the book, and I would like you to tell us something about your relationship with that character.
Oh, well, that's
how you
great
met
fun.
them, why you like them,
Oh,
what they're like. You don't need to touch on their role in the book, but you can get there. But there's a ton of names, and I'm going to pick them more or less at random. And then some of them I'm only picking because I have things I want to say about them, just so I can be involved in this conversation. But let's start with your mother.
Oh, my mother. Where to begin with my mother?
First of all, describe your mother, like physically.
Physically, my mother is a small woman who is, among other things, was a professor of linguistics, very distinguished scientist, instrumental in discovering the first gene for grammar, HOFXNP. We all had to learn the name of it when we were children. But she's a small woman. She also designs jewelry, and she wears somewhat eccentric clothing. So if you saw her, you'd see this woman with long, unkempt hair, looks a little like Stregonona, who's wearing all of this avant-garde jewelry. You can't really approach her to hug her because it's too dangerous. The jewelry is a little like barbed wire, and is in constant activity. Now, I should add that she's, a little more subdued now at 88 than she used to be. In the book, I go up to bake with her because I had never done that. I have a complicated relationship with her. I don't mean to be saccharine about it at all. We're very much alike, and she's a driven person, as am I in lots of ways, in every way. But she's an amazing baker, and she's an amazingly inventive and impatient person. And I thought in this book and in life generally that the best way I could connect with her was through a shared activity. It's always been the best way to connect with her. Can't really talk with her. Of course you can, but have a conversation. But the happiest moments were always when we were doing something together. I have this incredibly intense memory, which is the book begins with, of when I'm really little with I have many sisters, but this is my sister Allison, and she was unrolling strudel on a table. We were living in a housing project at that point, and just watching her, looking up and watching her unroll this strudel and make it kind of parchment thin. I thought, that's real. That was my first experience of mastery. And then snatching the thing. So that's my mother.
Since you're talking about your mother, I want to test out an idea. For the longest time, or not, recently, I have come to believe in the asymmetrical theory of parental memories, which is that everyone, when pressed, has way more memories of one parent than the other. So we all have one parent that we favor,
no,
but one parent who is
vivid.
Who consumes all of our kind of storytelling. In your case, your mother in your work has loomed much larger than your father.
Yes, even though, in fact, I'm extremely close to my father and admire him limitlessly. I dedicated the book on liberalism to him because he had taught me all of those things. But my father is, in his nature, a more recessive person than my mother. There is one chapter that's very much about my father in this, and it's the first time I've ever really written about him, about learning to drive. Because when I was learning to drive in my 50s with my son, Luke, we got our licenses on the same day. I believe that's the only time that's ever happened. We both did the test on the same day, one after another with the same driving judge, and then we got our licenses. And my father was haunting me the whole time, because my father is the most gently competent human being you will meet. And one of the things was he had been driving since he was 14, and he was the sort of person who thought nothing, he has 6 kids and 20 grandchildren, of driving to a grandchild in Baltimore from rural Ontario, where they live, for 19 hours. And he just would do things like that. He was an utterly competent man. And I think we all make ourselves a little bit in the shadow of our father's accomplishments, but also by bending away from the shadow into our own sunshine. So my father was so super competent in all those ways that I made myself notably incompetent. And in the little tasks of life. So my wife, Martha, did all the driving in our family, and I was the one as my daughter Olivia, who's here someplace tonight would point out, the gendered seat, which we usually assign to women in our culture, where I'm the one passing out the cookies and saying, hey, kids, you got to be quiet. Mom's trying to find the exit now. When will we be there? We'll be there soon. I promise you, we'll be there soon. Let Mom concentrate. And I was in that seat for decades, and then I wanted to just nudge over to the other seat a bit. And so that was very much about my father. But absolutely, my mother is the vivid person. The thing that my own favorite moment in the book, in an odd way, is that my mother is a crazy baker. She makes bagels in the Montreal style, which is far superior to the New York bagel. And she has kept a sourdough starter going for as long as I can remember. And as you know, the sourdough starter is called a mother. That's what you conventionally call it. And she's, gotten older, and she kind of put the sourdough starter aside. And only then I started looking into the nature of sourdough. And it turns out that the microbes on your mother's hands, or in the hands of any baker, will remain in the starter long after you've lost them and long after they've gone. So schmutz is the thing that lives after us, more than marble monuments or rhymes. What will, remember Philip Larkin wrote, "What will remain of us is love." No, what will remain of us is schmutz. It's the schmutz on your mother's hands.
You're neglecting your mother invented the boisson.
Yes, she invented a cross between the brioche and the croissant, which is fantastic, and I fear the recipe will go there.
Adam, how has this gone someone should commercial? This is
the difference between you and me, Malcolm. You should put it in as a part of the...
Gopniks have been sitting on a billion-dollar bakery idea for 30 years. Nothing has happened.
It's interesting you say that, because we should start a company. We should have a startup of it. Is that the one thing that my family was never good at was money-making ideas. That was never something that was part of what anybody talked about, or what, entrepreneurialness.
I couldn't, when you get to the point, by the way, it's a throwaway line in the book, which, first of all, is my only criticism of the book. I would have had several chapters on the boisson.
On the boisson.
And I got to that point, and I was furious with you. I kept on saying, is he going to come back to the boisson? Is he going to tell me where I can get one? He's going to tell me how to make one, how much it should cost. Nothing. You're just
I will do it. All right, I will do it as an appendix. I invented a new dessert in very much my mother's spirit, because I'm so much like her, and she taught me to cook, and cooking is the one thing I do competently. And I invented a new kind of flan. It's called the 5C flan. It's a coconut, cinnamon, cardamom, creme caramel. Those are the 5 C's in it, too. And it's terrific. It's a coconut flan that's also a creme caramel, and that has wonderful spices in it. And I'm passing out the recipe online all the time now. But I will get the recipe for the boisson and do it.
All right. Next name on the list. This is going to be a brief one. Neither of us knew him, but both of us are fascinated by him. Bud Schulberg. Can we do a Bud Schulberg shout-out?
We should definitely do a Bud Schulberg shout-out. We're better than at the Y. I've been trying to get the Library of America to put Bud Schulberg in print, for a while, and maybe I still can. Bud Schulberg is, as all of you will know, was a writer, a journalist. Most famous as a screenwriter. He wrote the screenplay for On the Waterfront and other things. But he wrote one of the most beautiful and forgotten novels in American English called The Disenchanted, about his bizarre adventures writing a screenplay with the then on the brink of death Scott Fitzgerald. And it's the most beautiful portrait of Scott Fitzgerald that we have. And then he went on to write, he comes up because he wrote a lot about boxing. And then he wrote a terrific memoir of growing up in Hollywood.
Book. Yeah, and we haven't mentioned What Makes Sammy Run,
which is his
the greatest book about Hollywood ever written.
Yes, and he invented the Sammy on the Run and all those too. It's a funny thing that happens, Malcolm. Certain writers, there is inevitably a kind of, apart from excellence, skill in sentences, subject matter, and all the other kind of the obvious things. Glamour attaches to writers very selectively. And Bud Schulberg was never a glamorous writer. Scott Fitzgerald is perhaps the ultimate example of a writer who is entirely his glamour, a writer of genius, a great writer, but glamour attached to him as naturally as...
Bud Schulberg, I read his memoir, and then I stumbled across somewhere an oral history he gave, and I realized, and this is the most bizarre, having listened to the oral history, someone just interviewing about his life, you realize he left out all the good bits in his memoir.
Yeah.
For a writer to leave out the good bits. So, for example, he has this extraordinary experience in the Second World War where first of all, he's part of this little select group that was such a horrible... I don't know if I can... It's going to bring us all down. The Nazis made these films of the most unspeakable of their acts.
Right.
And after the war, there was a race to find the film because it would be useful at Nuremberg before the Nazis destroyed it. And he was part of... he was racing around occupied Germany, not occupied, post-collapse Germany in a Jeep with like 3 other guys. Among them, he was in a group with the director Ford. What's his first name?
Director of?
Great director.
John Ford?
John Ford.
Oh, John Ford,
John
really?
Ford's part
right.
of this, and he are part of this group because they're from the movies,
Right.
so they have to find these horrible
Movies.
And then another weird Bud Schulberg story is after the Watts riots in '67, he rents a storefront in Watts, and he goes down there and he puts a sign on the door because he has this idea that what they really need to reach the troubled black youth of what really will calm the troubled souls of South Central is literature, and he wants to teach them about the great black writers of the day. And he sits and sits and sits, and no one comes for weeks. He drives once a week, drives down from Hollywood until finally this kid comes. And it's the beginning of a famous writer's workshop in Watts that becomes...
Okay,
but anyway, this is
good man.
remarkable.
Remarkable guy, and his stuff should be back in print. And indeed, I suspect, quick parenthetical, that his name hurt him. One of my pet theories is that writers are very dependent on their names, right? There's a moment, Dr. Johnson says someplace that there was a poet laureate in England named Elkanah Settle, and no one could ever believe that he could write a good poem with a name like Elkanah Settle. And I have struggled with this my whole life because Gopnik has got to be the single ugliest, most non-euphonious name there is. And Bud Schulberg, right? It sounds like a guy who runs a store, right? Whereas, J.D. Salinger is clearly a writer of note.
Yeah.
So that's something we all struggle with.
There should be a version of Ellis Island for writers.
Yes, exactly.
You get to their name.
Exactly. That's a whole story there about why the name Gopnik didn't get changed to Ellis Island, but I'll spare you for the moment.
Jamie Swiss.
Oh, Jamie Swiss is a dear friend. I just was texting with him. Jamie is the most gifted and most irascible magician there's ever been. He's a true intellectual of the magic world, and he is a truly contentious person. And what I love about Jamie is he's a magnificent sleight of hand man, a great teacher. He taught my son Luke card magic, and he was the most exacting, demanding, and rewarding, replenishing teacher you could possibly have. But Jamie's just a beautifully irascible person who cannot take anything lightly. As I say in the book someplace, that people don't take magicians seriously, right? And they go up to the magician and say, "Oh, I know how you did that," which is like going up to Yo-Yo Ma and saying, "Oh, I know how you did that. You just scraped that thing along the strings, didn't you? I know how you did that. I have an uncle who does the same thing all the time." And most magicians just kind of bite their lips and say, "Oh, good, I'm glad to hear that." And Jamie is the one who says, "You have no idea how the fuck I did that. You have no fucking idea how I did that. So don't tell me you do." And he's a contentious magician, and it's wonderful, and he's brilliant. He's one of my dearest friends, and I love him exactly because he takes magic at the most serious conceivable level and won't allow it to be minimized or condescended to. Though he did say to me once, the only reason mimes exist is so the magicians have someone to patronize.
What I love about by the way, the chapter of this book on magic is magic.
Thank you.
It is the heart of the book. It's just so...
May I just, not to interrupt you, but just to say that there's something about that chapter that no one has ever caught, that I worked harder to achieve, an invisible trick. There's a boy who's introduced at the beginning, who's the apprentice to the magician.
Sure, it's Luke.
It's Luke, but he's not named that way. And it's only at the end, and he's doing a trick called twisting the aces, where the card is introduced and then turned over, and only when you turn it over do you know it's an ace. And it's never explained that the boy in the story is my son, is the narrator's son, until the very last paragraph.
But any reader of Gopnik would
know that it was,
if a small boy or a small girl appears in one of your stories.
Yeah, this is true, undoubtedly, but I was pleased that I was able to twist the ace at the end. Anyway, what were you saying?
Yeah, as magic tricks go, that one is not a convincing one.
I show the card too clearly at the beginning of the trick.
Wait, a little more on Jamie Swiss. So describe him physically.
So Jamie has a kind of Van Dyke beard, and he wears black clothes or Hawaiian shirts. Got a bit of a pot belly. He's he has one of the great remaining Brooklyn accents. You know, you don't really hear that many great Brooklyn accents anymore since Brooklyn got overrun with Oberlin grads. But he's got one of the really great, you know, D's and Do's style Brooklyn accents you can have. What kind of trick are you doing there? And he's a Yankee fan, as there are too. So he's got all of that going for him. And he's, you know, he has presence, and he has the presence of grievance, because he doesn't feel magic is ever taken seriously enough.
Yeah. The thing that I never really understood about magic until you wrote about it, and I could never tell whether this is true of magic or just true of you on magic, which is that all these magicians, at least the ones you write about, have thought so deeply and beautifully and profoundly about their craft in a way that no other, you know, I've just spent, for variety of reasons, the last couple of weeks, months really, interviewing one trauma surgeon after another. And trauma surgeons are incredibly interesting. The work they do is really, 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 really hard. The technology changes and technique changes every 10 minutes. But they're not talking about it on a philosophical level. They've taken something that's beautifully, powerfully complicated, and they have made it intensely practical.
And they talk about it.
Yeah.
Well, two things I think are true. One is that shop talk is the most beautiful talk that there is. One of the reasons writers are so occupationally miserable is because we have no shop talk really to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Talk about keyboards, computers, advances, and publishers, and then that's it, right? Magicians have the most beautiful and rapturous shop talk of anyone because they can only talk about it to other magicians. They have a high level of trauma surgeon-like technique, but they can't tell you or me about it. They can only talk about it to other magicians. So there's an intensity, an intellectual intensity to what they do. I will add as well, of course, and this is the implicit, if tenderly loving accusation you're making, I seek out the intellectual magicians, and they choose to speak to me. I edited for years the greatest of jazz writers, Whitney Balliet, and I learned more from him about writing than just about anybody. But Whitney's jazz musicians would always pause and say, "It's odd that you asked me that question. I well remember my beginnings in Mount Vernon, Mississippi in 1922." And they would be the most loquacious and eloquent people. And you always wondered, was it that Whitney turned that on in them, or that there's an interaction between the writer and the subject. And our subjects very much often become like the writers, not because we make them, not because we fabricate them, but just because it's exactly the first principle of magic. It's the first thing those intellectual magicians tell you, is that magic is not in your fingers. It's not in the things you do with your cards. It's in the things you do with your mind and the way you throw it into others. So I suspect that just as jazz musicians confronted by someone who took them seriously, spoke seriously, I think that magicians, sensing that my level of empathy was based on a certain degree of intellect, responded to that, because that's their genius, the great magicians, is being able to enter into other people's minds. Like con men, only they're the honest liars.
Yeah. I wonder, it's funny you mentioned jazz musicians, because I was reading it totally separately as a collection of these great oral histories of the jazz musicians of the 40s and 30s in Los Angeles. And it's a pretty broad collection, and they're all interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all, in some way, they have a kind of, they've taken the time to think about how to present their world and their craft in a way that most of us
don't. Because they know that they're first-rate artists, and they were engaged in a monumental pursuit of artistry that was neglected, that was never sufficiently appreciated. So they have a case to make.
So that's interesting. So that a condition of interestingness in their profession is the chip on the shoulder. In other words, you kind of need to be neglected to be interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why politicians are so boring, successful politicians. Yeah. They just recite bromides, right? Because everyone assumes that they're interesting. They don't have a case to make. They don't have the intensity of obsession, which is what makes writing, which is what is interesting to hear.
Yeah. Let's do another magician. This really fun thing in your book when you're hanging out with Jamie Swiss and you go to David Copperfield's
library, museum, really, private museum of magic.
Museum in Las Vegas.
In a warehouse, in Las Vegas, yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about David. I thought what you said about David Copperfield was so
Well, David Copperfield is in that strange position, right, where he's by far the most commercially successful of all the magicians of his generation, but other magicians tend not to take him too seriously. They think his illusions are too broad. Remember, he made the Statue of Liberty disappear, and even you or I could figure out what was going on. And there's always a figure like that. It's sort of like, who to describe? It's like, this is a reference that you might remember, no one else here will. It's like the Guess Who in music. Remember the band, the Guess Who, the Canadian band? They had one hit after another. They did American Woman and all that too. But nobody ever took them seriously for a moment, right? And they had that perpetual chip on the shoulder. David Copperfield is sort of the Guess Who.
From Manitoba, I feel like.
Yes, they were from Winnipeg.
They were from Manitoba.
They're
There's
from
a
Winnipeg.
special category of the Manitoba, you know, the great breakout Manitoban. Am I right? Isn't it Joni Mitchell? Isn't she Manitoba?
No, Saskatchewan.
Oh,
Joni's
she's
from Saskatchewan.
Oh,
totally different world.
No, yeah, totally
different world.
Forgive me for that.
But my wife's family all comes from Manitoba. Martha's family are all Manitobans.
Which is, so speaking of, if professions have chips on their shoulder, which make them interesting, so do cities.
Yes.
Right? The neglected city, which is what Winnipeg is.
Yes,
With,
great city, but neglected, yeah.
I don't know whether great is the first word that comes to mind. But it does, you know, that the fact that the rest of Canada considers Winnipeg with a great deal of disdain spurs Winnipegians
to great achievement.
and the number, by the way, the number of great Canadian success stories that have come out of Winnipeg is as long as my arm. It's phenomenal.
I will add to that Martha's...
Wait.
Yes.
Didn't Scott Young, Neil Young's father, originally come from Winnipeg?
Yes, he comes from Winnipeg. Yes,
Yeah.
he hails from Winnipeg.
Is
Great
he-
Canadian sports writer.
Great Canadian sports writer, Izzy Sharp, the guy who founded Four Seasons in Winnipeg.
Well, you've put your finger on something very important about Winnipeg. How interesting is Winnipeg, everybody? But you put your finger on something very important about Winnipeg.
Yes.
Is that it's the one place in Canada where there's a very large Jewish community which intermingled with a very large non-Jewish community. Martha's parents are an Icelandic girl who married a Jewish boy. That didn't happen in many places in Canada.
That's interesting.
And it was the presence of a Jewish community that wasn't completely hived off onto itself, but
Yeah.
I think is the secret sauce of the
Well,
greatness
it's also
of
the
Winnipeg.
center, it's the intellectual center of Mennonite life
Yes.
in Canada as well. So it's this strange mixture of this kind of hardy Eastern European Jewish ethic, this tons of like Ukrainians, and then all these Mennonites kind of sturdily moving along.
And a huge Icelandic community,
Yeah.
which is where Martha's family
We're
comes
making
from.
there'll be a gold rush in the direction of Winnipeg when we're finished.
Absolutely.
Wait, so who are we talking about? Copperfield.
Yes.
Where is this great barn he has full of artifacts?
It's someplace, you know how it is when you're on a late night tour of Las Vegas, you have no idea where you are. It's like when you're in Los Angeles and they put you in a car and drive to someplace called Pico, and then 45 minutes away, there's another place that says Pico Boulevard.
Yeah.
And you never can figure it out. Las Vegas is a bit like that too.
Yeah. And he has this giant warehouse full of the most extraordinary collection of
magic relics,
artifacts.
yes.
And he has no interest, he only shows it to a select few.
Yes, he shows it to people he thinks will relish it and appreciate it. And there are great things in it, like, as I have the thing, Mellini's Erdnase, which would be meaningful only to another magician or another lover of magic. It's a book by a guy named Erdnase that was owned by a great magician named Mellini.
And Copperfield, the way that you describe, you go a little bit into his psychology, which I thought was really interesting, that he's not the kind of,
No, I'm not sure I fully recall how I evoked him, but he's not.
He seemed needy.
Yes, he seems needy. I was trying to find a word rather than needy because he was extremely generous to Luke and me in showing us his beautiful things. Yes, he seemed to want the approval of magicians who were much less worldly, who were much less successful in worldly terms than he did. And there's a certain kind of master who's like that, who needs the approval, as I'm repeating myself, of people less obviously successful than they are. It's an interesting type.
Yeah. All of these guys were in your telling of the music, so the magic chapter. There was a store near where the Verizon building is.
Yes, that's exactly. It was the original Tannins. The original Tannins Magic was this great emporium of magic down near Bryant Park now, long gone. But it was like 3 stories of magic wares and magic demonstrations and this great wall that had the pictures of all the great magicians on it. And it's one of the great losses, at least in my imaginary New York, that's gone. 10 and still persists, but it's like 2 rooms in the 5th floor of a building on 34th Street.
What is it that drew you to magic? Was it that, did Luke discover it, or did you?
Luke, it was simultaneously that my son Luke discovered magic and found that it gave him far more meaning, accomplishment, significance than anything he was studying at school. So I was drawn into it through Luke's obsessive interest in magic. But then I loved it too once I started going to Monday Night Magic and to other things too, because it seemed like such a model of art. Of a very modest kind. You know, magicians aren't because they feel oppressed all the time. But the idea that you would have a profound technique that you kept to yourself, the idea that your primary impulse was to entertain rather than to impress or to intimidate, that would be that you would have all of these skills, but you would use them for the purposes of delight. That spoke somehow to my ideals for writing and my ideals for art generally. And I was very instantly taken by the company of magicians. I loved the company of magicians. The people I most have enjoyed hanging out with in life are magicians and cooks. And they have a great deal in common. There's an artisanal basis to everything they do. They are expert at doing something. But they tend to be very temperamental, people who have very difficult lives. Nothing is harder than running a restaurant except running a magic show. And yet, the whole purpose of their existence is to delight. And I find there's something sort of noble and even saintly about that.
But there's no high theory attached to the
cooking?
chef.
Oh yeah, there is. If you get chefs talking, I don't have it as much in this book, but you get chefs talking about the ethics of seasonality or what counts as local and what doesn't. Or you even get them talking about whether you have tarragon leaves or tarragon stems in a béarnaise sauce. They'll go on forever. You know, they have the same kind of passionate shop talk, which I love to hear.
George Plimpton. I bring him up only because this is a kind of, is this book in which I realize we never actually explained it properly. In this book, Adam goes on a series of quests to master certain activities, baking, boxing, magic, etc., driving.
Drawing, boxing,
is the first one. And I'm wondering, to what extent, is it an echo of George Plimpton? And how do you feel about George Plimpton's contribution?
That's such an acute question, because I deliberately dropped George Plimpton's name in the opening chapter, thinking no one will pick up on my little homage to Plimpton in the opening chapter because it goes by very quickly. But I put it there exactly for that reason. I didn't want people, this is not a Plimpton-like book. If any of you are young enough to remember, George Plimpton did these wonderful books, Paper Lion, Mad Ducks and Bears, about his own engagement. As an amateur, he would go and he would box with Archie Moore, or he would play quarterback for the Detroit Lions and so on. And so there's certainly an element of Plimptonness in this. His book, Mad Ducks and Bears, is one of the most entertaining sports books ever written. So I greatly admire his prose writing. You know who was a big fan of George Plimpton is Philip Roth. There's a whole section in Philip's book, Exit Ghost, which is just about his admiration for George Plimpton. It's the most bizarre little fan note ever. But it isn't a Plimpton-like book in the sense that Plimpton's comedy came out of his incapacity to do it. Plimpton was he was a wonderful writer, but he had kind of one joke to tell, right? I attempt to do this thing, I learn a lot, and then I fail at it. And I wanted to tell 2 jokes. I attempt to do this thing, and I enter into the world of the people who do it. Well, Plimpton did that too, I guess. But yes, certainly Plimpton is one of the ghosts who's someplace in the back of the book, and I put him in one sentence. And you caught it.
But I want you to talk a little bit more about the difference. So both of you are beginning in the same spirit,
yes.
Which is there are worlds outside your own experience that fascinate you, and you would like to bear witness to them, to experience.
I guess, and I say this, there's every reason to prefer Plimpton's approach, which is more amateur, to my own. But I can't resist being a bit of a generalizer, a theory producer about it. And the book is full of my generalizations, my guesses, my attempts to find the commonality across all of these dimensions, boxing and dancing. What do they have in common? What's similar about the way we learn them? I can't not be my mother's son in that way. My mother was a professor, my father was a professor, all of my brothers and sisters are professors. So I am the only one who isn't. I'm what's called a Jewish dropout. So I think that urge to teach, to explicate, is very strong. It was not at all, Plimpton was an aristocratic WASP, and for him, teaching and explicating, I think, was a little vulgar.
He's a performer.
Yeah, he's a performer, yeah.
A literary performer, and yes, you're much more of a teacher.
A professor, yes.
Yeah,
I'm a ham as well, but there's more professorialness in my performance than there ever was in his.
Yeah. It's funny, I prefer I don't mean to in any way diss Plimpton.
It was a wonderful writer.
Enormous respect. I prefer your way. I always felt there was something a little bit, the joke got old for me with Plimpton.
I think, look, that's one of the things that every writer worries about, right? Is the moment when something that began, as I know Plimpton's did, in just the springing forward of love and enthusiasm, becomes a shtick. I'll tell you something. I had the 5 most amazingly happy and productive years of my life in Paris when I was writing the pieces that eventually became Paris the Moon, and it simply couldn't have been a more joyous time. And people have often asked me, why did you leave? You used to write so well. Why did you stop? And the truth was that I feared it was, to be honest, I knew it was good, and it was good, and I feared it would become a shtick. That if I stayed in Paris, things that had been natural outpourings of attention and affection, going to a gym, having a baby, all those things, I had never plotted them. I never thought, I will write about having a baby. We had a baby, and I wrote about it. And I genuinely feared, and it was exactly the moment when something that was more natural in New York, I thought about learning to drive in Paris. I thought, ooh, that's a bit of a shticky idea, right? You'll do, and I could almost write the comedy. And that was one of the reasons why we left Paris, is I never wanted that to happen. I never wanted, when comedy goes stale, it becomes shtick, and I never wanted that to happen in Paris.
But you felt it would happen after just 5 years?
I feared it would. I hope I was wrong, because I'm going to go back to Paris and write another book. But yes, in retrospect, that was odd. When you're younger than I am now, everything seems like it's taken a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's a very good question. It's a very hopeful bit of therapy here. I don't know why I felt that at that time. We had just had a baby. I mean, the other reason we went back, and it's in Paris the Moon, is that Martha said, we have a beautiful existence in Paris, but not a full life. And in New York, we have a full life, but not a beautiful existence. So we chose the full life over the beautiful existence.
Wait, first of all, that's kind of fantastic. But why did you resolve... and so the full life is preferable to the beautiful existence?
Yeah, that's it. Aesthetes prefer a beautiful existence to a full life. Parents prefer a full life to a beautiful existence, I suppose. Yeah. And that was a parental imperative. I
can see, I can sort of understand. I mean, my great fear if I moved to Paris is that you would run out of things to say, because so little happens there outside of, everything's happened.
Right.
So little is happening, right?
Yes, well, that's true too. That was partly true too, though I love it. It's my favorite place on earth. But yes, there's an element of that, and that was a subject to write about. The nothing happening was a wonderful subject to write about for a while, and then it becomes stale.
Yeah. One thing you don't talk about in this book was your foray into music.
I do talk about it a bit. A little bit, not at great length.
I was wondering, can you talk a little bit? We've got time. We have some questions.
Right.
But actually, this feeds into one of the questions here. One of the questions here is, you have so many passions, how do your various interests intersect? And if I might venture a kind of opening answer to that, is that there has always been this kind of desire to experiment with your experiences in a way that's not true of a lot of, very adventurous. And one of the adventurous things you did was describe a little bit about your kind of musical adventures. And
well, when I came to New York, when Martha and I came to New York on a bus from Canada, like in a bad 40s movie, I wanted to be a songwriter. That was my primary ambition. I wanted to be a songwriter and a writer for the New Yorker. I figured I could do both. I could be Stephen Sondheim and John Updike simultaneously. That turned out not to be the case. But I wanted to do that, and I never pursued it adequately. You know, it was one of those things that I left behind too soon. So in the course of life, a wonderful composer, David Shire, approached me about writing a musical with him. And somewhat to his shock, I jumped at the opportunity because it was the form I love most in the world. And we wrote a show called Our Table, which you can find on Spotify. And we wrote some 60 songs together. And I loved it.
Excuse me, how many songs?
60 songs.
60?
60, because that's the usual ratio in Broadway musicals. They have a very strong, you call them trunk songs. You write 60 songs and you throw out 40. I mean, that's the standard rate at which it's done. It's a funny thing, not that the 40 are worse than the 20. It's a kind of weird, kind of almost religious discipline that Broadway people have. And in any way, I loved...
Wait, hold on. I can't get over this. 60. So every Broadway play has 40 songs that are just lying in a vault somewhere.
Yes, in a word, yes. And those are called trunk songs. I don't know if it's always 40 and 20. It could be sometimes 30 and 10. But yes, every songwriting team and every Broadway songwriter will tell you that even Sondheim threw away 4 different endings for Company before he arrived at being alive. It's part of the discipline of the craft. I'm not always sure that it's a productive discipline in the sense that the ones you throw away may actually be better than the one you arrive at.
Does anyone independently analyze the ones that are thrown away? Like, there should be some central committee of Broadway that kind of takes all these in and...
Like a FDA inspectors who come in and say, you don't have to throw this away. This smells good to me. Yes, exactly.
This is unbelievable.
It's
so show-offy, by the way. The rest of us are like making use of every last scrap, and the geniuses on Broadway.
What happens is then you get a whole kind of sub-industry of passionate appreciators of cut songs. So people who are really love the Broadway musical, what they really love are cut songs. They trade cut songs. They have bootleg recordings of cut songs. And the people who really love Stephen Sondheim love his cut songs much more than they love his real songs. So the cut song is one of the great fetish items of musical theater. So I did that, and I loved it, and I wrote all the lyrics, and I felt, and I put myself to work to master that craft and that art as much as I could, because my ultimate heroes, Lorenzo da Ponte, Larry Hart, took part in that field. And our show had a fine, though, run in New Haven and never transferred to New York. And then I'm hard at work right now on another show with a wonderful composer named Andrew Lippa.
You have no fear of embarrassment.
I live in total fear of embarrassment. But I suppose when it comes to the contest between my egotism and my embarrassment, my egotism wins somehow. I don't know. I mean, if I can put it in slightly kinder terms to myself, I'm ambitious. And I like doing ambitious things. And it's not like I'm out there, trying to compete with Elon Musk in rocketry. What I'm good at, or what I believe myself to be good at, is shaping sentences. And some of those sentences are essays. That's the form I love most in the world, is the essay, what's sometimes called the personal essay. But writing lyrics or writing a show is, it's the same enterprise, right? It's organizing language in ways that express emotion. And for me, the thing I love most is exactly the moments in that act when you get an emotion and an idea humming together. And that's what I always try to do in things, is what you were talking about before. And when it's just ideas, it feels arid to me. And when it's just emotions, it feels amateurish to me. And there's no form known to man in which ideas, you did this, you talked about this in your Paul Simon audiobook. There's no form in which ideas and emotions come into such intimate entanglement as in a song. So anybody who can write one good song, one memorable song, has got a little bit of purchase on immortality. And I think I've written one, but I will continue to write more.
You're, I recently, it hasn't come out yet, but I wrote an episode of my upcoming podcast season is so Gopnikian, if I might
What's it?
say. And it's funny, had I never read or any of your work or known you, it would never have occurred to me to do this.
And it is?
It was, I participated in this debate in Toronto, the Monk debates.
Sure.
And I lost by the largest margin in the history of the Monk debates. And it was like deeply, humiliating on a level that it was just like so shockingly like just destroyed. And so I decided to go to debate school in Brooklyn with these high school students. And I took debate classes, and I had all these debate coaches go over my performance, and they raked me over the coals for hours. It was fascinating.
But you did formal debate in high school, right?
No. I did it, like twice.
Oh, right.
But high school was 1977. This is, it's like...
1977 doesn't seem that long ago to me,
But I thought about this book when I was after the experience, and I said, well, if Adam can teach himself to box...
Well, I was being taught to box. Right.
Yes, but my point is, if Adam is willing to,
right. I
don't think I'm in any way disparaging you when I say that.
I am not. No,
you're not a natural.
I am not
boxer.
I am not a natural boxer.
I don't look at you and think Sugar Ray Leonard. No.
No, and in fact, I haven't actually had a bout yet because they have to find another short Jewish writer in his 60s who's been doing a sedentary occupation and has very flat feet.
I'm sure there's a variety of candidates in the audience.
And it's hard to book that fight. But if anybody wants to, I'd have to be angry. You'd have to do it for a benefit, then I'd be inclined to do it. So it'd have to be a Republican, to make it really work. But
the other thing I thought about, again, this is just about me, if that's okay.
Yeah, please. We've had enough about me.
No. I thought about it with respect to this book, but on one level, what this book is about the special pleasures of mediocrity.
Yes.
And because you embark on a series of things, and implicit in, not all of them, but in some of the things that you embark on, is the idea that you're
never going to be good at them.
You're never going to be good at them.
Right.
And this is the great discovery of my middle age. When I was very young, I only pursued things that I was good at. And I realized when I hit 40 that was a trap. And you know why I realized it? I realized it because I went to Bard. I was using the library. Oh, no, I was using the gym. And when I was using the gym, I saw the Bard lacrosse team practice. And I observed them, and I observed that they were the most laughably inept lacrosse team I'd ever seen. And my first thought was, I have all kinds of athletic pretensions, right. So I was looking down my nose. And then my second thought was, that is fantastic, because it means that anyone who wants to play lacrosse at Bard can play lacrosse at Bard. Yes. And that is such a better model than every other lacrosse team. If you want to play lacrosse at Johns Hopkins, it's impossible.
Because you're never going to be good enough.
You're never going to make the team.
Right.
A pleasure is denied to you. Why? For the completely random and totally unfair reason that a small number of kids have been playing lacrosse in suburban Baltimore since they were 6 years old, because their parents had the nutty notion that mastery of lacrosse was something they wanted to have their kids.
And it would get them into Johns Hopkins.
But so what do? We impoverish the vast pool of kids who would really enjoy playing lacrosse in favor of a small. Bard flips it and just says, we're going to have a bad lacrosse team.
Yes, I know, but not to be pious, but that's sort of one of the themes of the book. It maybe is the theme of the book. Because the truth is, and I have a little chapter called The Mystery of Interiority, where I look into that old folk legend that hummingbirds and elephants have the same number of heartbeats in a life, and find that there's actually, at the University of North Carolina State, there's a scientific team that looks into this question, that took up this question, and it's true. And the point of it, the metaphor of it is that the hummingbirds sense of existence is just as extended as the elephant's. It just is only that feels that way for the hummingbird, right?
Yeah.
Not for the elephant. And in exactly the same way, the accomplishments that we master or attempt to master, at which we're no good, give us the same sense of, little steps turning into a seamless sequence, the sense of the flow, which is the key to happiness. Happiness is absorption. Yeah. Happiness is reaching that flow state. And in a weird way, anytime you achieve it, you have the hummingbird's heartbeat inside you. You have a strong interior sense, like the kids at Bard, right? They didn't know they were bad lacrosse players, and I'm sure they talked about lacrosse all the time and tried to improve their game. And that's exactly by...
No. They do know they're bad lacrosse players. No, I don't mean that as a joke.
Right.
Because it's the corollary to the observation that there is beauty in
badness.
Right. Is that the second thing is that it is only through pursuing something, not badly, you weren't bad at these things, but inexpertly,
yes,
that you come to a full appreciation of the expert.
Yeah,
the person who goes up to the magician and says, I know how you did that, right, is someone who doesn't try to be a mediocre. They haven't. If they were a mediocre magician, they would know
better, that they would be in awe.
Precisely how they would be in true awe. It's the same thing. I was going to say this with, it is only when I became a mediocre runner in my middle age, right, that I began to appreciate what a world-class runner can do.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's only by being a terrible pianist that I have some glimpse of what it is to be Bill Evans or Earl Garner.
This is the greatest case. This is the full argument for community theater.
Yes, this is true.
Which is the kind of whipping boy. Community theory is the whipping boy of every pretentious intellectual. I grew up with community theater, and I'm here to tell you, it is civilization is
community theater.
Is based on community theater. I mean that.
But that's not, who said that? Forgive me for a professorial moment. Frederick Law Olmsted, the great designer of Central Park and one of the great American political thinkers, said that the thing that, the commonplace civilization of a liberal society depended on community theater. He talked about glee clubs. He talked about amateur opera societies. That's the living, beating heart of a liberal society, are those things. Yeah. And I should add, too, if you read the biographies of any of the great makers of the American theater, read Moss Hart's wonderful book, Act One. He spent his entire apprenticeship in community theater, in little theater, as they called it in those days, because that's where you could learn, and that's where you could achieve a sense of mastery. And being cut off from that is a disaster. I don't mean in any sense, I think that knowing what it's like to be good at something teaches you what it's like to be good at something, but knowing what it's like to be bad at something teaches you what it's like to be good at something as well. And community theater is an absolutely vital building block, metaphorically, for a liberal society.
There's another running observation. At the Armory uptown, where they have an indoor track, they have these, in the winter, they have these all-comers meets. Anyone could show up. And so I went to one recently, and they had the featured race of the evening was the 3,000 meters. And if memory serves, there were 11 heats. And you seed yourself. So the first heat is the really, really, really good, and they're like gazelles are flowing around the track, and you marvel how. And then the second heat is slightly slower, and then the third one. So by the time I got on, we were, trundling around. But it's this, you had this beautiful image represented in front of you. You have every form of mastery. You have the
ultimate and the mediocre and the
21-year-olds.
Futility.
And I was there with the white hairs but it made it so much more. The fact that I was permitted to participate alongside the experts is what made it insanely fun. And the idea that the experts were not condescending to be with us. They happily joined in an enterprise which was open to people of every level.
Of every level.
There's something indescribably beautiful about that.
It's the essence of pluralism. That's what we mean by living in a pluralist society, is that's available to us. And yes, and I think that's one of the things that the points I wanted to make, or one of the things I acquired from all these experiences, is exactly that the level of inner satisfaction, the experience of the flow, which is the opiate of the human mind and the human soul is available across this broad range of things, and even more that in the things, we all know the things we're good at, but one of the things that's true about the best runners in that meet are never satisfied with their performance, right? They never go away thinking, oh, I really did it. They can always do better. And we feel that way about the work we do, right? Can always do better, never satisfied with it. And this piece kind of just managed to get by, right? And so being in touch with the foundation of that, with things that we do poorly but we're getting better at, is hugely analgesic.
Yeah, yeah. Do we have to stop? I don't know. Is there any guidance?
Give me one more name. I'm loving this so much.
Oh, okay. I'll give you one more name.
It's like being in therapy. And
well, I don't know whether I want to do Mr. Rocker. That seems like a lot.
That's a lot.
It's too late. It's too late for that. People read the book for that. It's actually, I will only say this as a plug for the book. This is one of the biggest reasons to read this book. It's actually an incredibly moving, and I thought The Magicians was my favorite chapter, but the Rocker chapter is actually incredibly moving.
No, I'm glad to hear it.
Really is. But that's for you guys to discover.
It's about struggling with a phobia, and that's...
Yeah. Who's another one to... Let's finish with... we could do another musician. Let's do David Blaine. Why not? Let's finish on magic.
David Blaine was... So Luca, my wonderful son, who is now doing his PhD in philosophy at the University of Texas. After all of his adventures, magic and music, he ended as a philosopher.
He rejoined the family business.
He rejoined, that's what my mother always says. He's going into the family business.
He went abroad to seek his fortune, and then he came back and settled for a job in...
Yes. He went to work as David Blaine's personal assistant. David offered him that job, and it was a wonderful learning experience, much better than going to progressive school, because he had to learn how to keep, Russian models away from each other and how to care for an albino alligator and many other things. And David, in the middle of it, David, a thoughtful guy, was doing, this is my favorite anecdote in the book, was doing a bullet catch. Now, bullet catch, he was doing it for a TV special. And in the bullet catch, the magician has a steel cup in his mouth or her mouth, and somebody fires a bullet from a rifle directly into the cup. You have to catch the bullet. And now normally it's done as a trick, as a gaffe, because it's too dangerous. 12 magicians were killed in the early part of the 20th century doing the bullet catch on stage. So nobody does it that way. And Luke explained to me David was going to do a true bullet catch. And I said to him, well, how do you do a bullet catch? And he said, well, it's a very strong titanium cup, and it's a very low velocity rifle and a very small caliber bullet, and it's all laser guided. I said, oh, really? I said, so there's no trick to the bullet catch? And he said, oh, no, Dad, there's a trick to the bullet catch. The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. And as soon as Luke said that to me, I said, that's the wisest thing I've ever heard, right? Because we all instantly know what that means, right? That after all the preparation you do when we're writing or talking or anything else, after all the ways in which you make sure that you will not be killed by the bullet, at some point you have to stand there with your mouth open and the cup in it while somebody points a rifle at you. And that for me is the existential leap that we all have to make in artistry, mastery, whatever we choose to call it. And I thought it was a wonderful story because everybody knows what that moment is of catching the bullet. I almost wanted to call the book Catching the Bullet, but since I've written so much about gun control, my wise publisher thought they would have people would have a false idea about it.
Yeah.
I think we're being told that we have to...
That's it, I think. I was only going to say that trick can only be done in certain states.
Yes, exactly.
Stand your ground laws.
Can I thank you, Malcolm, for your incredible generosity in doing this? And can I tell you a story that I don't think you know? Is that Malcolm is known in our house as my children were growing up as not that you're not Dad Malcolm. Because this is the conversation we would always have. Malcolm would come for dinner, dazzle Luke and Olivia, and then go in and they would say, Malcolm tells the most interesting anecdotes, and he always finds the one right story to illustrate it. Not that you don't, Dad. Or Malcolm always has exactly the right question to ask. Not that you're not doing that, Dad. And so in our household, Malcolm Gladwell is known as Not That You're Not Dad Malcolm. So thank you. Not that you're not.